Twelfth Night party with Gyles Brandreth and friends. Twelfth Night, that most teasing and ambiguous of festivals, sits poised between endings and beginnings, between the solemn hush of Christmas fading into memory and the brisk, forward-leaning optimism of the new year asserting itself with quiet insistence. It is a night for misrule and merriment, for wit loosened from its stays, for conversation that slips its tie and sings. It is, in short, a night that seems almost to have been invented for Gyles Brandreth. The house, already warm with candlelight and conversation, seemed to know this. Long before the guests arrived in earnest, the rooms hummed with anticipation, as though the walls themselves were recalling past laughter, old jokes, the residue of cleverness absorbed into plaster and wood, the scent of beeswax candles mingled with orange peel, clove, and something unmistakably festive yet faintly theatrical, as though Noel Coward had once passed through and left his cologne behind. Outside, the winter air held its breath, cold but courteous, while inside the party prepared to do what Twelfth Night has always done best, overturn the ordinary rules of time and temperament. Gyles Brandreth, host and ringmaster, stood in the hallway adjusting a scarf of heroic proportions, the kind that suggests not so much protection from the cold as a declaration of personality. It was patterned, unmistakably patterned, in a way that refused to apologize for itself. He surveyed the scene with satisfaction, eyebrows raised not in surprise but in expectation. Gyles did not attend parties. He curated them. He did not merely invite guests. He assembled constellations. Each person present had been chosen not only for who they were but for who they would become in proximity to one another. Twelfth Night, after all, was Shakespeare's night, and Shakespeare was the presiding spirit of the evening, invoked in quotation, allusion, and the occasional gleeful misquotation. Somewhere between the coat rack and the drawing room, Gyles murmured a line about cakes and ale, and one could not be entirely certain whether he was quoting Twelfth Night or merely channeling its ethos. With Gyles, the distinction was rarely important. The first arrivals were old friends, the kind who did not ring the bell so much as announce themselves through laughter already in motion. There was a novelist whose sentences were as long and looping as country lanes, arriving with a scarf nearly as assertive as Gyles's own. There was a historian, burdened with anecdotes the way a medieval monk might be burdened with manuscripts, eager to unburden herself at the nearest receptive ear. There was a comedian dry as winter toast, whose humor lay not in jokes but in the surgical timing of a raised eyebrow. Each was greeted as though they were the guest of honor, because on a Twelfth Night hosted by Gyles Brandreth, everyone was, at least for a moment. Names were repeated with affectionate emphasis, hands clasped, cheeks kissed, compliments dispensed, with the generosity of a man who never feared running out of them. Coats were taken, scarves admired, hats commented upon with the seriousness usually reserved for works of art. The drawing room soon filled with voices layered like harmonies. Conversations began, paused, intersected, and then resumed on entirely different subjects without apology. Someone was explaining the curious afterlife of Shakespearean fools and restoration comedy. Someone else was recalling a disastrous attempt at amateur theatricals involving a missing donkey and a collapsed stage. Laughter rippled, not in waves but in eddies circling back on itself. Drinks appeared as if summoned by incantation. Mulled wine, deep and fragrant, was ladled with ceremonial care. There was sherry for those who preferred tradition unadulterated, gin for the modernists, and something experimental involving rosemary that provoked polite debate. Gyles presided over the drinks table briefly, long enough to deliver an anecdote about Noel Coward's views on hospitality, before being pulled away by a guest who wished to tell him something urgently amusing. As the evening unfolded, it became clear that this was not merely a party but a performance, though no one had been given a script. Roles emerged organically. There was the raconteur, whose stories grew longer and more elaborate with each retelling, accruing details like barnacles. There was the listener, nodding encouragement, storing up material for later reflection. There was the provocateur, tossing intellectual grenades into otherwise placid conversations, just to see what would happen. Gyles moved among them all, a benevolent force of narrative gravity, drawing people together, redirecting conversations, rescuing the shy from the margins and introducing them to someone who would make them feel instantly indispensable. He had the rare gift of making everyone feel not only welcome but necessary, as though the party would be incomplete without their particular voice added to the chorus. At some point, inevitably, Shakespeare himself entered the room, not as a topic but as a presence. Someone recited a sonnet not from memory but from love. Someone else challenged the interpretation cheerfully, and the debate that followed was spirited but never sour. On Twelfth Night, disagreement was part of the fun. It was a night for turning ideas upside down, for trying on different opinions as one might try on masks. Food appeared substantial and symbolic. There was a Twelfth Night cake, dense and ceremonial, hiding within it the traditional tokens. Slices were distributed with mock solemnity. Who would be king? Who would be fool? The discovery of a dried bean prompted cheers. The finding of a clove provoked theatrical groans. Crowns were produced, slightly battered but proud, and placed upon heads with exaggerated reverence. The king for the evening, a mild-mannered academic with a secret fondness for limericks, was obliged to issue decrees. These were mostly ignored, except when they aligned conveniently with existing desires. But the ritual mattered more than obedience. The fool, crowned with equal enthusiasm, took his role seriously, offering commentary sharp enough to draw blood but delivered with such charm that no one minded the wound. As the night deepened, the party took on that particular quality known only to successful gatherings, when time loosens its grip and the outside world feels implausibly distant. Clocks were glanced at and then dismissed. Someone sat on the floor untroubled by convention. Someone else began a story with, "This reminds me of something that happened in 1973, and no one objected. Music drifted in, not as background but as participant. Old recordings, chosen with care, filled the spaces between conversations. A madrigal here, a Noel Coward song there, something unexpectedly modern that nonetheless fit the mood. A few guests sang along softly at first, then with growing confidence. Harmony was attempted and in places achieved. Gyles, watching it all, felt that particular satisfaction known only to hosts who have succeeded, without quite knowing how. The party had taken on a life of its own. It no longer required management. It simply needed to be allowed to continue, to unfold according to its own internal logic. Twelfth Night had been honored not with pomp but with wit, warmth, and a generous disregard for tomorrow morning. And still the night went on, gathering stories, accumulating memories, weaving connections that would be recalled months later with the phrase, "Do you remember that 12th night at Gyles's? If you would like me to continue?" Seamlessly toward the full 10,000 plus words, just reply "continue," and I will carry straight on without changing style or pace. The hours slipped past with the stealth of practiced conspirators, unnoticed until they were already gone, leaving only their laughter behind. Somewhere between the second bottle of wine and the moment when coats became distant rumors, rather than practical necessities, the party crossed an invisible threshold. It ceased to be an event and became a small temporary society, complete with its own rules, hierarchies, legends, and shared language. Twelfth Night, true to form, had done its work. In one corner of the room, a debate had sprung up about memory, whether it was fundamentally creative or merely selective, whether remembering was an act of truth-telling or of storytelling. The historian argued for structure, dates, footnotes, the anchoring of recollection to verifiable fact. The novelist countered that memory was closer to poetry than prose, shaped less by chronology than by emotional weather. Gyles hovered nearby, delighted, occasionally interjecting with an anecdote about Samuel Pepys, whose diary, he insisted, proved both points simultaneously. Pepys, after all, had written with astonishing immediacy, and yet edited himself, mercilessly even as he claimed candor. Across the room, two guests who had arrived, as polite strangers, discovered a shared enthusiasm for theatrical disasters. One recalled a production of Macbeth interrupted by a fire alarm during the witches' scene, lending the moment an unintended realism. The other topped this with a tale of Twelfth Night itself, performed outdoors where a sudden gust of wind had sent Malvolio's yellow stockings sailing into the audience, never to be recovered. They laughed with the intimacy of people who felt they had found their tribe. Near the fire, a quieter conversation unfolded. An elderly poet, her voice soft but precise, spoke about the way festivals functioned as punctuation marks in the year, giving shape to time that might otherwise blur into formlessness. Twelfth Night, she suggested, was a semicolon rather than a full stop, a pause that allowed reflection before moving on. Her companion listened intently, nodding, later admitting that he would steal the metaphor for a lecture. Though he promised to credit her, she waved the idea away with the generosity of someone who had long since stopped counting intellectual property. Every so often, someone would raise a glass to Twelfth Night or to Shakespeare, or simply to this, gesturing vaguely at the room, the people, the indefinable sense of rightness. Each toast was received with enthusiasm disproportionate to its eloquence. Eloquence, after all, was abundant already. The kitchen became, as kitchens always do, a secondary stage. Guests drifted in ostensibly to fetch more drinks, but stayed to engage in conversations, more intimate than those in the larger rooms. Here confessions were made. Someone admitted they had never actually read Twelfth Night all the way through, despite having seen it performed 6 times. Someone else confessed to an irrational dislike of Orsino. These admissions were met not with judgment but with curiosity. Probing questions, playful arguments that ended in laughter rather than resolution. Gyles entered the kitchen bearing a tray of mince pies like offerings. He launched into a story about a 12th night he had once spent in Stratford-upon-Avon, where an actor playing Feste had delivered the final song with such melancholy that half the audience wept and the other half felt oddly cheated, as though sadness were an affront to the occasion. But that's the trick of Twelfth Night, Gyles concluded, setting down the tray. It pretends to be all laughter, but it knows exactly where the shadows are. This observation lingered, quietly altering the tone of the room. Not darkening it exactly, but deepening it like adding bass notes to a melody. Conversations took on a slightly more reflective quality. People spoke of endings, of transitions, of the strange relief that came with letting go of the Christmas season at last. One guest remarked that Twelfth Night always felt like permission to stop, pretending the new year had already settled into shape. As midnight edged past, the party showed no sign of dissolving. Instead, it reorganized itself. Chairs were pulled into new configurations. Some guests drifted away, embraced warmly, promised reunions that everyone knew would be difficult to arrange, but sincerely meant nonetheless. Their departures were marked, not with sadness but with a sense of narrative completeness, as though their chapters had reached a natural pause. Those who remained seemed bound together by a shared decision not to rush. Someone suggested a game, something involving lines of Shakespeare, recited out of context and guessed by others. This quickly descended into gleeful chaos, with wildly inaccurate attributions and deliberate absurdity. "That's definitely King Lear," someone insisted of a line from The Tempest. "No," came the reply, "it's clearly from a parking ticket." Laughter echoed off the walls, startling in its volume. The house absorbed it, storing it up like heat. At some point, Gyles produced a battered book of verse and began to read aloud. He did not perform so much as converse with the poems, offering asides, background, personal memories associated with particular lines. A poem by John Betjeman prompted a recollection of a luncheon that had gone disastrously wrong. A limerick led to a brief but passionate defense of the form as one of the great achievements of English literature. No one disagreed, at least not out loud. The reading segued naturally into reminiscence. People spoke of their first encounters with Shakespeare, with poetry, with theater. One recalled seeing Twelfth Night as a child and being profoundly confused by the disguises, yet deeply moved by the ending without quite understanding why. Another spoke of performing viola at university and realizing, only years later, how radical the character was. These stories overlapped, echoed, contradicted one another, forming a collective memoir stitched together from individual threads. The Fool, still wearing their crown slightly askew, offered a mock-serious analysis of why Twelfth Night parties mattered more than New Year's Eve celebrations. New Year's Eve, they declared, is about promises you can't keep. Twelfth Night is about acknowledging that and laughing anyway. Applause followed, sincere and loud. Fatigue made its presence known eventually, not as an intruder but as a gentle tap on the shoulder. Voices softened. Movements slowed. Someone dozed briefly in a chair, waking with a start and apologizing unnecessarily. Another wrapped themselves in a throw and declared it the most comfortable they had been all year. The final phase of the party had arrived, that liminal hour when conversation turns inward and silence has become as meaningful as words. People sat together without speaking, content, The fire burned low, candles guttered. Outside, the night edged toward morning. Gyles took a moment to stand back and look at the room. The crowns lay abandoned on side tables. Empty glasses bore witness to the evening's excesses. Books lay open where they had been consulted, argued over, forgotten. The scene had the quiet disorder of something well lived in. He felt, not for the first time, that hosting was a form of authorship. One could not control the characters or the plot, but one could create the conditions under which something worthwhile might happen. Tonight something had. As the last guest prepared to leave, coats reclaimed and scarves rewrapped, there was a reluctance in the air, a shared desire to linger in the afterglow. Goodbyes were elongated, punctuated with promises and jokes and last-minute recollections of things meant to be said earlier. The door opened and closed, each time letting in a breath of cold reality before sealing it out again. When at last the house fell quiet, Gyles moved slowly from room to room, extinguishing candles, straightening cushions, collecting abandoned glasses. The silence felt companionable rather than empty. Twelfth Night had been observed properly, he thought, with enough mischief to honor tradition and enough reflection to justify it. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten almost imperceptibly. The year had turned its corner. The party was over, but its effects would linger, in remembered laughter and future conversations that began at that Twelfth Night party, in the knowledge that such gatherings were possible and worth the effort. Twelfth Night, with Gyles Brandreth and friends, had once again proven itself not merely a date on the calendar but a state of mind, a reminder that wit, warmth, and words could still conjure a kind of magic, even in the depths of winter. Morning, when it finally asserted itself, did so without drama. There was no sudden blaze of sunlight, no trumpet call to announce the return of the everyday. Instead, a pale, tentative light crept along the edges of the curtains, like a courteous guest unsure whether they were truly welcome. The house, having hosted its share of brilliance, accepted the dawn with quiet dignity. Gyles, who had slept lightly and intermittently, rose before the light had fully made up its mind. He moved through the rooms, with the peculiar intimacy that follows a successful gathering when a house feels less like a structure and more like a collaborator. Each object seemed to hum with residual meaning. A wine glass left on a windowsill became evidence of a conversation paused but not finished. A scarf draped over a chair was a ghost of its owner, still animated by the gestures and laughter of the night before. He paused in the drawing room, standing still as if listening for echoes. In a way, they were still there. A particularly enthusiastic laugh seemed almost audible near the fireplace. The cadence of a poem lingered in the air, though the words themselves had dissolved. Memory, he reflected, was a form of acoustics. Some rooms retained sound better than others. The Twelfth Night cake sat on the sideboard, reduced now to crumbs, and a slightly lopsided slice no one had wanted to claim. The crowns lay beside it, absurd in the morning light, their tinseled authority stripped of enchantment, and yet Gyles could not bring himself to put them away immediately. They were ridiculous, yes, but they were also relics, evidence that for one night, the ordinary rules had been suspended by collective agreement. Later that morning, messages would begin to arrive. Some would be texted with breezy enthusiasm, others composed with the careful affection of people who wanted to capture something, fleeting before it faded. Such a wonderful evening, they would say. So lovely to see everyone. Still, laughing about the limericks. Remind me to tell you my thoughts about that Peeps story. Each message would be a small continuation of the party, a refusal to let it end neatly. But for now, the quiet held. Gyles made tea strong and restorative, and sat at the kitchen table, gazing out at a winter garden that looked, in its frost-muted stillness, like a stage awaiting a new production. He thought about Twelfth Night as a tradition, about how it had survived not by rigidity but by adaptability. Once it had been a night of licensed chaos, of servants ruling masters, of boys playing women playing men. Now it was something gentler but no less subversive, an excuse to talk too much, to listen carefully, to stay up later than was sensible, to say things one might otherwise swallow. In the days that followed, the party took on a second life in recollection. At lunch tables and on walks, in emails and chance encounters, it was revisited, reshaped, embroidered. One guest remembered a conversation that another swore had never happened. Someone else was convinced that a particular joke had been funnier than it objectively was, and perhaps they were right. Memory, like Twelfth Night itself, refused to be pinned down. The novelist began a new piece of work, its opening scene unmistakably inspired by the gathering, though the details were altered just enough to maintain plausible deniability. The historian referenced the party obliquely in a footnote, as an example of living tradition. The poet wrote a short, deceptively simple poem about crowns left on tables at dawn. The academic king of the evening delivered his promised limericks to a seminar group, who received them with baffled delight, and Gyles inevitably told the story again and again, each time slightly differently, each telling shaped by the audience before him. He emphasized the wit when speaking to comedians, the literary references when among scholars, the warmth and conviviality when recalling it for those who had been unable to attend. In this way, the Twelfth Night party expanded beyond its temporal limits, becoming not a single evening but a shared myth. What made it endure, perhaps, was not any one moment but the way it had allowed people to be fully themselves, exaggerated and softened at once. Twelfth Night had always thrived on such paradoxes. It celebrated disguise in order to reveal truth, foolishness in order to expose wisdom, excess in order to arrive at balance. Gyles Brandreth, with his theatrical instincts and genuine curiosity about people, had simply provided the conditions. As winter progressed, the memory of the party acted as a small internal hearth for those who had been there. On bleak evenings, someone would think of it and smile. In moments of intellectual dryness, another would recall a conversation that had crackled with energy and feel renewed. These were not grand transformations, but they were real. And when the year eventually turned full circle, when Christmas decorations once again appeared in shop windows and calendars, crept toward January, there would be an unspoken anticipation. Someone would ask, casually, "Are you doing anything for Twelfth Night this year?" And someone else would reply, "I wonder what Gyles has planned." Because once such a gathering exists, it creates its own expectation. Twelfth Night, after all, is not about repetition but about recognition, recognizing the value of shared time, of conversation that wanders and wonders, of laughter that does not need an occasion but benefits from one. The party with Gyles Brandreth and friends had been, in its way, an argument for culture as something lived rather than consumed. Shakespeare was not revered from a distance but invited into the room. Poetry was not dissected but spoken aloud, allowed to breathe. Wit was not weaponized but shared generously. Even disagreement had been handled with playfulness, as though everyone understood that the point was not to win but to engage. This too was part of the Twelfth Night inheritance, the idea that intelligence need not be solemn, that seriousness and joy were not enemies, that the end of a season could be marked, not with regret but with gratitude. The party did not mourn the passing of Christmas. It waved it off cheerfully and turned toward whatever came next. In that sense, the Twelfth Night party was less a conclusion than a hinge. It connected what had been with what might be. It reminded its guests that the year ahead, however demanding, would still contain moments of absurdity and brilliance if they made room for them. Long after the last glass had been washed and the last candle stub discarded, long after winter had given way to spring and the memory of frost seemed implausible, the essence of that night persisted. It lived in an increased willingness to host, to invite, to risk the chaos of bringing people together. It lived in the confidence that such chaos, properly framed, could produce something rare and sustaining. And somewhere, perhaps on another Twelfth Night yet to come, someone would raise a glass and say, "Do you remember that party with Gyles Brandreth and friends?" And the room would respond, as rooms always do when a good story begins, by leaning in. Please like, subscribe, and share for more. Thanks for watching.